And our next speakers program will be Saturday, June 8th, when we will welcome Rick Evans, who is a docent at Leo Carrillo Historic Park in Carlsbad. He's also the vice president of the Friends of Carrillo Ranch. And he will be speaking on the history of Carrillo Park and Leo Carrillo's life. So mark that on your calendars. Our speaker today is Richard Carrico, professor of history at San Diego State University. He's made a number of appearances here before, speaking about various aspects of San Diego history and enlightening us all the time. And he has a new part of our history to talk about today, his new book, Monsters on the Loose. Without further ado, I introduce Richard Carrico.
Thank you. So before we start, let me apologize for my voice this morning. I've been out weed whacking the last 2 days and cutting stuff, and I think the pollen got into my head. So hopefully I'll be understandable. As I hear myself, it's a very different voice, so you can just pretend this is my real voice. So I gave a talk like this a couple of weeks ago to the South Bay Historical Society, who meets down at the San Ysidro Library, a brand new library down there, really beautiful. And I got a lot of really good reviews and comments afterwards, except there were a couple women who said, I really didn't like his talk, it was gruesome. So I'm going to give you a disclaimer here to begin with. I'm not showing any photographs except one that might be a little disturbing. But I don't find it gruesome in that it's history and it's what went on back in 1931. So, this is the cover of the book that you see over here, and you can certainly buy as many as you want. I have a lot in my Jeep, as well as here. So, when I started this, and I know Peggy and Vince know this very well about how research works, it's kind of like when you start cleaning one of your junk drawers in the kitchen, and 5 hours later, you're painting and doing your windows because one thing leads to another. And I was actually commissioned about 7 years ago to write a history of the Verona and Viejas tribes and how they ended up where they are today. So if you go to Verona and Viejas today, almost at my timer here, it's not where they started. There's a lake called El Capitan Reservoir. That was their homeland. And their village is underneath the lake. So I was hired by them to document all that for some things they were doing, which is probably going to lead to a court case against the city of San Diego, I hope, frankly. And so I was looking at 1930, 1931 documents, because that's when they were about to be moved. It went to the Supreme Court. And I won't say I was getting bored, but I was getting bored. And I was reading old newspapers online and old documents and all that. But in the newspapers, I kept seeing young girl found murdered, young boy found in the bay, 2 young women found. And so I would kind of, on my lunch hour, instead of reading about Capitan Grande and Verona and Viejas, I would start reading about these murdered girls. And within 2 or 3 years, I had a giant folder, and a lot on digital as well, about these young women. And I decided I was going to write an article or 2 for the Journal of San Diego History, or for some other historical society, and then suddenly that turned into a book. Well, suddenly, 10 years, roughly. And that's what this is about today. So I'll tell you a little bit about San Diego in 1931. The population was less than 150,000. And downtown was the big deal, Broadway, that whole area down there. And we were the second per capita, we were the second largest city in terms of suicides. Second in the nation. Who do you think was first? Chicago, for whatever reason. Yeah, well, I know why, but anyway, yeah. So why were we second? We were second because a lot of, in the 1928, 29, 30, 31 period, a lot of people with health problems moved out here. Because back then we hadn't changed the environment with all of our exotic plants. So they came out here if they had TB or asthma or allergies because there wasn't all the pollen that would affect them. And of course then they proceeded to garden, you know, and add pollens. But they didn't get cured, if you will, and so at some point they started killing themselves. And the preferred method of death, by the way, was turn on your gas range and put rags under the door and just die. But occasionally the neighbor lit a cigarette and the gas had got into his room and the apartment house blew up. So it was an interesting time in San Diego. Prohibition was in full swing. It was probably the height of the Depression in terms of unemployment, at least 25, 28%, something like that, 1931, started in 1929. And businesses were drying up and blowing away in San Diego, not that we had a lot anyhow. But it was also a movement in American history, and I look out on this audience and I look back at myself, you'll appreciate this, because we talk about the 1960s as if that was the first time there was a sexual revolution in America, right? Or the first time that the music really changed, or that the skirts got short, or whatever, right? Because that's how we want it to be, because that was our generation, the baby boomers. We did all this great stuff. We protested, we whatever, right? It happened in 1931 as well. We were coming out of the flapper era, if you will, but a young woman, like two of the three we're going to talk about, were called modern women. Modern women meant they smoked. In fact, one newspaper article talked about this young lady smoked Chesterfield Unfiltered. Oh, and she wore short skirts, and she listened to big band music, right? Not the old polkas. And they stayed out late at night. And the automobile changed America, right? So now you could get into a car with your date and go who knows where. In fact, the University of Chicago banned automobiles on campus because they were, what they say, vehicles for lewd behavior. Right? There you go. So it was an interesting time. The big stars of the time, and I would have to admit, I didn't realize this when I started the book. A lot of the women, young women, wanted to look like either Betty Davis or Joan Crawford or Stanwyck, right? I only knew them as older, not terribly, to me, attractive women. But then I went back and looked and went, wow, these were some beautiful, beautiful women. So that was your role model. So for my granddaughter, it's Taylor Swift, or who knows who, right? But back then, it was Barbara Stanwyck, and they were modern women. They were also modern women. Because of their movies, they were strong women. And that was kind of code. A modern woman was a strong woman. You gotta look out for them. You gotta look out for them. Okay, so why this topic? So this is my 5th book. I wrote one on the history of wine and winemaking in San Diego. Gave a presentation on that here. I wrote one called Strangers in a Stolen Land, which was about the Kumeyaay Native American people, that's on Amazon. I wrote one on the history of Ramona, the town, not the person. And I wrote one years ago on haunted houses and places in San Diego County. None of those have anything to do with this. But why this topic? Because the more I got into it, first of all, they were all unsolved. These 9 murders were all unsolved. So that, as an archaeologist and historian, kind of stimulated me to want to do something about it. They were all women. 8 of the 9 were women. I pared it down to these 3 we're going to talk about. And I did not like the way women were treated in the press in 1931. We were still in sort of the yellow journalism period, coming out of Hearst and his newspapers. Everything was scandalous. If it leaves, it leaves, you know. And I noticed that for 2 of these young women, and others, they were described as extremely attractive, well-rounded, voluptuous, short skirt wearing, cigarette smoking, multiple boyfriends. In their, not their obituaries, but in the coverage of their murders. But if a handsome young man died, they didn't say stud found dead on the street, or well-muscled young man. They said young attorney, right? So the misogynistic sexism of the press in the 1931s, the code was almost, in two of these girls' cases, they had it coming. That was almost the code. Because they went out late at night, because they dated, quote, indiscriminately. What does that mean? What does that mean? All right, so that was part of the reason I wanted to cover this topic. What's the hurdles and issues? Well, it was 1931. Everyone is dead who had anything to do with this, right? A long time ago. And major hurdle, neither the police department nor the sheriff's department would share any information with me. So I did what's called a California Public Records Act request, which is a Freedom of Information Act request for the state of California, asking the sheriff, 1931, share all your records with me. And they sent me a very polite letter back saying, no, these are open cases and we're exempt. Yeah, we're exempt. So being the diligent person I am, I called them up and said, okay, well, if it's open, who can I talk to? Well, we didn't say it's active, it's just open. So under California law, they don't have to share anything about an open case. That I just said that no one was alive. As I was finishing up the book, a 92-year-old man called me up and said, I wasn't alive at the time, but I had a good friend who was. Let me tell you a story. So we'll talk about him. What's the reviews and the receptions? Well, you might notice, if I brought the report, this one. It actually won a gold medal in a national true crime contest. And I actually had a couple of reviewers saying, wow, you're going to write some more true crime. And I thought, yeah, maybe. But I'm not a true crime writer, for sure. Okay, so it's been pretty well received. It's selling on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and stuff. So, if you woke up February 12th, 2 days before Valentine's Day, 1931, and you picked up the San Diego Union, remember back when we had newspapers? Yeah, we had 3 in San Diego. We had 3. This was your headline. So, I don't know how much you know about San Diego, but there used to be a city called East San Diego. There was San Diego, and there was East San Diego. Where did East San Diego start? Started at Boundary Street. That's why it's called Boundary Street. It was the boundary between East San Diego and the city of San Diego. They had their own police department, they had their own mayor, their own charter. Ultimately, it got folded in. So who is the young girl? Well, her name is Virginia Brooks. She was 10 years old, and I don't know how much geography you know of San Diego, so I'll sort of lay it out for you. Virginia and her family, her 2 brothers, her mom and her dad, lived at 54th and University down in East San Diego, so a little south of El Cajon Boulevard. And every morning during the school days, 5 days a week, Virginia would walk the mile to school. Unheard of today. I know, unheard of. All the soccer moms load people in and drive them 8 blocks, right? But a mile. About halfway there, she would meet her friend Lucy, and then they would walk together. So she would walk west on University Avenue, which parts of were unpaved. It was kind of the boondocks at the time. There were vegetable farms out there. There were a couple of dairies, very, very close. And she'd walk the mile, and at Euclid, where today there's a building called the Tower. It's been there since 1926, I think. She would make a right and go to Euclid Elementary. Good student, cute, liked to read books. She was in the Girl Scouts or the Cub Scouts, whatever the girls' version of that was. Everybody liked her, and she wore her hair cut really short. So her name was Virginia Brooks, but there was a famous silent screen actress called Louise Brooks, who had a pixie cut that was really common, and it was like the rage of the time. Plus, her mom, it was the Depression, cut her hair, so that was reasonably easy to cut. So she went to school, and then she disappeared. So her friend Lucy waited and waited and waited, was going to be late, and then decided to go to school without her. So here's little Virginia, and this is the dad, and the mom, Blanche. So we think about Photoshop, cut and paste, disinformation being modern. This was the 1931 version of cut and paste. They took a picture of the newspaper, cut it, and superimposed her on the parents. This is not a real photograph. It's not a real photograph. This is the dress she was wearing the day that she disappeared. Her mom had made it for her with a pattern from Good Housekeeping. Okay, 10 years old. Kind of old-looking shoes. It's the Depression. It's the Depression. Okay, so they start looking for her. And at the time, in 1931, this was the largest manhunt, in this case, little girl hunt, in San Diego history. Boy Scouts went down the canyons looking for her. The Coast Guard actually flew airplanes over the canyons, trying to see if she was down there. And one of them actually scraped a bunch of the brush. They were going so low, the wheels scraped some of the brush and almost killed some Boy Scouts. And to show you the view of the press at the time, the press described, wow, this is quite the manhunt. And it said, can you imagine women put away their frilly dresses and put on their work clothes and walked in the canyons looking for her? Oh, hard to imagine. Women are supposed to just stay in the kitchen and hope for the best, right? So, quite the manhunt. They drained a couple of ponds. The police went out and arrested what they called the usual suspects, which the newspaper called perverts and degenerates, and to no avail. So she was gone at 10 years of age. He was a truck driver, part-time truck driver, and Blanche, of course, in this time period was a homemaker, again, with two sons. So, 2 months later, Mr. Moses here and his dog Blackie, except sometimes Blackie's called Shep in the newspapers and in the investigation, were out on what's called Kearny Mesa, up by Miramar, actually Miramar Mesa, right by, if you were on 15 and you were going towards Miramar Air Base, there's a Miramar Way before you get to Miramar Road. If you made a right, which there's no reason to because it dead ends at a fence line, right beyond that place is where he's standing. So Shep alerted him to a couple burlap bags, burlap sacks. And when Moses went over and looked at them, it was Virginia. It was Virginia. So he ran out to what was old 395, almost a half a mile, not quite a half a mile, alerted a truck driver. Truck driver went to Old Town near his phone and called the sheriff. The sheriff came out. And there's Virginia being carried down to the morgue for the autopsy. Interesting thing, in 1931, the press and the police were like brothers. They hung out together, they smoked cigars together, they went to the racetrack together, allegedly went to the same houses of prostitution, and if there was a crime scene, the newspaper men were right there with the police. So these are guys from the mortuary. This is the sheriff. And these are two newspaper guys just walking around the crime scene, right? No yellow tape, kicking dirt, doing whatever they're doing. So the good news is, though, lacking documents from the sheriff, is the newspapers covered this murder and the other two really well. Covered them very, very well. The autopsy report said she'd been half buried somewhere for a while because of insects and animals, and where she had been buried, her head had basically come off her body. And so the newspaper said she'd been decapitated. She had not been decapitated. I found the autopsy report. But it was kind of a bad scene. They said she was disemboweled. She was not disemboweled. Insects got into her, and basically she bloated and fell. But she had been strangled with her own dress strap. Back then, they never used the word rape. They didn't use the word rape in the newspaper until about 1948, 1950. They either said sexual assault, but more commonly just assault. If the word violent wasn't in front of it, assault with a female meant rape, not for men. She had not been assaulted sexually. Apparently, her body was in such bad shape. So now we switch from a missing person to a homicide. So they went out again and started arresting men and frankly beating some of them up in the police station to get a confession from them. She had a book bag with her. So here's what they found in the burlap bags. They found her book bag with 3 books in it. She had 2 Indian head nickels in her dress pocket. She had dried flowers because she was taking a bouquet to her teacher. So it looked like he had buried her and kept the stuff with her, and then when he went to move her, because she wasn't buried here, he gathered everything up and took it and put it in the burlap bags. You would think that probably he made the move because they were getting close to finding him or finding her. Why else would he do that? Or there was something raising suspicion. This is one of the books that was in her book bag. So last March, not 2 months ago March, but March of 2022, last March, I wrote an article for the Reader. I don't know if you ever look at the Reader newspaper. It's largely an advertisement for cannabis products anymore. But I had written for a contest a story and sent it to the Reader. And they were going to pick the top 3. And it had to do something with the history of San Diego. I came in 4th, apparently. I came in 4th. So I didn't get published until the editor of the Reader called me up after the contest and said, hey, I really liked your article. And you came within 1 vote of getting published, but I'm the editor, so now I'm going to publish your article anyhow, even though you didn't win the contest. And they paid me actually really well for it, and it was on one of the murders that we'll talk about, not this one. And that's going to lead to all kinds of things. First of all, as this book was about to go to print in the fall of this year, of last year, I'm at a winery. I always am on the weekends. I was at a winery called Sierra Roble Winery up in Warner Springs, where I live. And I would highly recommend it, by the way. And my phone rings, and I answered it, and this person said, I'm Lieutenant Lisa Brandon of the San Diego Sheriff's Department. I'm going, this can't be good. The Sheriff's Department, why are they calling me? And she said, I read your article in the Reader, and you know more about this case than we do. And I go, well, thank you. And she said, will you share some of your information? They have a grant. The Sheriff's Department has $1 million grant to do DNA on cold cases. And she's been assigned 1926 to 1936. So she's trying to see, is there still stuff in the evidence room for these cold cases that she can run DNA for? And she was telling me all this, and I said, well, do you have the hair? Because she had 3 strands of hair in her hand. And she goes, we have the hair. 1 is hers, we believe, and 2 are not. And she goes, how did you know about the hair? And I said, I'm really good at what I do. I know about the hair. So we agreed we would share a little bit of information. She said, legally I can't. And then she sent me this photograph of the book. So this is the book that was there in the little book bag. And we had conversations over time. Ultimately, she sent me an investigation report by the sheriff on this case, and she had redacted some things. So I called her when I got it, and I said, what did you redact? Well, they used the N-word, that they had arrested 2 N-word people. I go, oh, so you don't want me in my book to do? She said, no. So that's why that's redacted. And I said, but there's one, I'm reading this, and I kind of know what was going on. Is that redaction the son of a very famous family here in San Diego who was known to be a pedophile? And she goes, you are so good.
Wow.
So you know who it was? I said, yeah, it was one of the Benbow children, young adults. And she goes, I didn't say that. So interesting thing going on there. This little headline would appear about every 3 days. Arrest is near. We're trying to be affectatious in San Diego in the newspapers, so it's a clue spelled the British way. So they thought the sack would be good. They got these almost brand new burlap bags, so they went to the different feed stores to see who sold that kind of bag. Every feed store in San Diego used the same bag, basically, right? They tried car prints, they had tires, Firestone. Every Model T came out with a Firestone tire exactly like that. So they didn't get anywhere. So what's this? This is March. This is about a couple days later after the discovery. So and here's Moses down here. Yep. So wishful thinking indeed. So it became a cold case, and gradually it faded from the headlines. Mr. Brooks went up north to the state of Washington to do lumberjack work, because he was pretty good at it. So he left his wife and his 2 sons for a while, went up there. There was some discussion about maybe there were some arguments in the family. A couple letter writers thought maybe he did it, that he killed his own daughter and now he was trying to escape and all this stuff. And the last thing that appears in the newspapers and in documents pertinent to this was about 3 years after the death, when Blanche died in the county hospital from an abortion gone wrong. So if the husband's up north, why is she having an abortion? So there's a whole side to this story that I've talked now to some of the descendants. So many of them were not aware that that's how Blanche had died, for instance. So I was telling them things about their family. Okay, so we'll just set that one over there. I will tell you in advance here, I am no closer to resolving that murder than they were back then or than the sheriff's department is now. But the 2 strands of hair that were in her hand are at Quantico right now at the FBI, and they're running DNA on them. So how would that help? Well, you've probably seen some of the TV shows about what they call genealogical DNA, right? They're going to get a type, and then they're going to go through all these databases and maybe find a cousin or somebody, and they're going to trace it back, hopefully. And then I'll redo my book. I'll have to redo my book. Helen Bradshaw was about 24, and she worked downtown at the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad Department in a stenographer. She was described as attractive, for sure. And she was dating a guy named Moss, not Moses, but Moss Garrison. And he picked her up after work one day. He worked there too. Picking her up from work meant walking to her office and asking her out on a date. No one had cars back then unless she was somewhat middle to upper class. So they went out to a date, went to a movie downtown on Broadway, at the Broadway Theater, I think, saw a movie. Then they walked up the street and went to another movie. Movies were 25 cents. The Coca-Cola was a nickel. Hershey bar was a nickel. Buttered popcorn with, gosh, actually real butter, not that nasty stuff that's in theaters now. Popcorn was, 7 cents or 7.5 cents, something freaky. So they went to a double header. They saw 2 movies. And of course, at intermission, there was usually a newsreel and a Looney Tunes cartoon with Bugs Bunny, right? So at intermission, he bought her a Hershey bar, popcorn, and a Coca-Cola. We know this, I know this. And they got out at 10 of 11, and then he walked her home. This is hard for most people to believe. They walked 4.5 miles home. It was the Depression. They were young. They were in love. So they walked up 5th Street, 5th Avenue, out of downtown, made a right at Laurel Street, walked across the Laurel Street Bridge, which when I was in high school, by the way, was called Suicide Bridge, because before the Coronado Bridge, that's where you jumped. Walked across the Laurel Street Bridge, went past all the museums, got to the water fountain, made a left, went past the carousel, down towards Roosevelt Middle School, past that, up Park Boulevard, down to Meade Street, 2 blocks down, kissed her goodbye, heard the screen door shut, and ran back to make the streetcar at 12:05. I think it was the number 2, and then he transferred to the number 7. Anyway, so he's sitting playing cards downtown the next day, a Sunday, and he doesn't realize that Richard and Jess here were walking around what's now Roosevelt Middle School and the War Memorial Building, that area right over there. And Richard here, on our right, looks over a wall of the old Indian village that was built there for the exposition and tells his buddy, hey, there's a mannequin. There's a mannequin of a girl lying back here. Come and look at it. And his buddy Jess looked at it and said, that's a dead girl. That is not a mannequin. So they ran to Richard's house, I believe it was Richard's house, told the mom said, oh, it was probably a mannequin, went out and looked at it and said, yeah, it's a dead girl. Ran back to the nearest house, called the cops. So this is Hazel Bradshaw's death scene. So she was found right here. Sheriff, 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 newspaper, newspaper, police, police. The two boys, some random sailor. Great crime scene, all right? Great crime scene. So she was found stabbed to death. Not here. She'd been moved here from somewhere. Found stabbed to death 11 times. As I'm going to show you on the autopsy report, she had defensive wounds on her hands. You probably know this from crime, that if someone's being stabbed, you tend to fight, and you invariably get stabbed somewhere along in here. So this was the death scene that morning, and then here's the headline. So her boyfriend, Moss, is playing cards. Newspaper boy comes in with an extra, a morning extra. Girl found dead in the park. And he buys the newspaper and holds it up and realizes this is his girlfriend that he dropped off the night before. So he tells his card playing friend about this, and he says, you need to go turn yourself in to the police right away. They're going to be looking for you. And they were. And they were. So here's the autopsy sketch. An 1 3/8 blade is reasonably wide, and it was double-sided, double-bladed. So it's either a hunting knife or a butcher knife. It's not a pen knife or a little pocket knife, right? And it was substantial enough that it went through her chest region and actually lacerated her pulmonary artery, which is probably how she died from that. Here's the lacerations on her hands. And then strangely enough, she had one on the back and two there, as if she was turning. So I had to go through a lot to get this, because luckily the sheriff didn't have it, but the medical examiner had it, and they weren't sure that they wanted to release it. But I have a friend who's an attorney, and he talked to them, and they did. And so that's the sketch of her. So they arrested him. When he turned himself in, they arrested Moss Garrison. He was described in the newspapers as the little southern gentleman or the little southern elf or whatever. He was about 5'4", 5'5", which by today's standards is quite short. Actually, then it was only about 3 inches shorter than the average man. The guy born about this time would have been 5'7" was the average. When I was born, it was 5'9". Now it's 5'10" and a half for men, Caucasian men at least. So he was arrested, and they beat him up, allegedly, and tried to get him to confess to it, and said, if you don't confess, we're going to put you on trial, and you're going to be hanged. You're going to be hanged. He did not confess. He said, I had nothing to do with it. So here's his story, which I told you. He took her home, and he got on the streetcar and went down to his apartment down in San Diego. So this is going to go to trial. This is going to go to trial, so I have good information for this one. This was part of the long walk home, by the way. You and I never saw this unless you're really, really old. But there used to be a pond underneath the Laurel Street Bridge. It was fed by a natural spring. And then when they put in the highway, 395, they drained it and capped it and took the water somewhere else. This is the house that he walked her to. It's still there. Yeah. So I'm out there photographing one Sunday morning. This guy comes out in his robe, a very large gentleman, I might add, and asked me what the hell I was doing. And I told him, I'm doing something about a 1931 murder. And he goes, yeah, sure. Yeah, sure you are. Come to find out, he was going through a very bad divorce, and he was convinced I was a private investigator. I should not tell you this story on myself, but at one point, I did have, not in this state, I did have a license to be a private investigator. And in this state, I did have a license to carry, because Sheriff Collender and I were good friends. And that particular day, I actually had a 9mm Glock on me. And apparently my jacket came open a little bit, so he was really convinced I was a private investigator or somebody. But when he saw that I had a gun in a holster, which I can't even explain to you why, that's a long story, he got nicer. He got nicer. And he showed me the inside of the house. The house the same as it was, except for these vinyl windows. It's virtually unchanged. It's been rebuilt once. So this became important at the trial, not this photograph, but this image, because of this. At the trial, here's the trial. So there's Hazel's dad, Hazel's mom, Hazel's sister, and then the crowd. You had to get a special ticket to come into this trial. This was the trial of the century. What was the last trial of the century? OJ. So this was the trial of the century in 1931. And people would show up an hour before court to get their lottery ticket to hope they can get in. Newspapers covered it like crazy. Okay, so here's what happened at the trial. Prosecution said, we didn't look for anybody else, it's clearly him, and here's all the reasons. The mom said she never got home that night. He lied, he did not get her in that door, because I always sit by the door and wait for her. Well, he said he did. They got the conductor of the streetcar. He said, no, he got on the streetcar near Meade and Adams Avenue at exactly 12:02, 12:03. He just barely made it. Because the prosecution said, no, he never got out of Balboa Park. He killed her in Balboa Park and then went home. The conductor said, he got on my car and he wasn't covered in blood. He still had a nice tie on. He was sweaty from the run, but he wasn't, agitated like he just killed somebody. The lady who lived across the street and would have had this view said, well, I didn't see him walk her home that night, but I'll tell you what I did see about Hazel. Some nights, very late at night, a dark coupe would pull up in front, and she would sneak out the front door and get in it, and come back at 3 or 4 in the morning. So, needless to say, the press played this up, again, salaciously, but also importantly, that she apparently had something going on after midnight. So maybe he walked her home that night, she went in or did not go in, and a car picked her up later. A black lady who was a housekeeper a little bit over here on this side said, oh yeah, I saw the same thing. I saw the same thing. She was sneaking out at night all the time, all the time. What do you think the prosecution said about a black lady giving testimony in 1931? You can't trust those black people. You can't trust those black people. Okay, so we got that. He had some cuts. Moss had some cuts on his hand. Oh, clearly when you stab somebody, you get that. And his poker playing buddy said, well, actually 2 days before he had those cuts on his hand, because he worked in the commissary and he was playing poker with us 2 days before the murder, and he had trouble dealing the cards. So much for that. And it went on and on and on. The beauty of this trial was, historically, it was one of the first trials in San Diego for a murder that had women on the jury. Had 2 women on the jury, because you just got that right about 5 years before this. And even then, most judges didn't want to handle a jury of women in a murder case. You know why? You're too emotional. You're too emotional. And in some cases, there are grotesque murder scenes, and you're just, we can't do that to you. Right? Okay. So, at the end of the trial, not guilty. Unanimous. In fact, after 2 weeks of trial, they went into the deliberation room, they ordered coffee and pastries, and 45 minutes later came out and said not guilty. And the jury foreman, who was a Republican gentleman who lived in Point Loma, quite wealthy, actually turned to the prosecution and castigated them and said, why did you even bring this to trial? Why aren't you looking for the real killer? Does this sound familiar? Yeah, the real killer. And he said to them, so now that we have found him not guilty, what's your next plan? What's plan B? And they said, well, we don't have a plan B. And they stopped looking. It was the end of that. So I interviewed by phone Hazel Bradshaw's grand-nephew, I think he would be, and he's convinced that Moss did it. When I started just telling him the story a little bit more in detail than he knew, he said, oh, so you're sympathetic to the killer. And I said, do you know who the killer is? And he goes, yeah, it was Moss. I go, no, I don't think so. And he goes, yeah, the family does. So there's still family history that Moss was the killer. Okay, here's the saddest one to me. In this photograph, Louise Tauber is 16. She's 16. And this is her high school picture. She went to the same high school that I did, separated by 30 years. She went to San Diego High School. She was not a very good student. She was working downtown at a 5 and dime store called Cresses? Yeah. She was working down there in the hardware department. She was, in fact, I just want to say, very beautiful for her age indeed, but the newspapers really played it up. They did use the word voluptuous and well-rounded and all that good kind of stuff. She dated a lot of guys. This was brought out in all kinds of testimony and stuff. And she got off work downtown at the 5 and dime at about 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening. She went and bummed a cigarette for the taxi driver because she smoked, points against her there. And then she went and saw another friend and tried to borrow some money from him because she wanted to run away from home and go to Chicago where her grandparents were, because her father was overbearing. The mother had died a few years before. The father ran a hair shop at University and Normal Street. If you know who that is, there's a sushi place there called Ichiban, really, really good. And now there's a hair salon where his hair salon was. And the building hasn't really changed a whole lot. So she was going to run away. He said, I can give you a couple bucks, but not much more than that. They waved goodbye. This was a photograph taken 2 days before that, downtown. She's 17 by this time. This is her house, 1931. So I want you to imagine Louise walking out this door and going across this bridge that goes across Washington Avenue. And now it leads to the Ralph Shopping Center at Vermont University. When I was growing up, it was the Sears store, right? The big Sears store that was right there. So she walked across, took the number 5 or 7 streetcar downtown, went to work, got off work, had a cigarette, tried to bum some money, disappears. This is the house today, virtually unchanged. This guy was much nicer, nor was I carrying a pistol. This guy was much nicer and let me in and showed me what would have been her bedroom. He wasn't aware of this story at all, but he said, somebody told me my house, a picture of my house was in the Reader a couple of weeks ago. And I went, yeah, actually it was. So what I wanted to know was, is this door and this door the same? Because as a writer, I wanted that image. This simply means I'm at 40 minutes, so. Because this is a 3-hour story. So we talked about it and all that good kind of stuff, but 1931,
Why did you want to know the door was the same?
Pardon me? It was the same.
It was.
The door was the same, and in her bedroom it had little wooden floors and all that, and I could just imagine it. It was a very small, it's a small bungalow type house. Yeah. It's just so neat. I was going to PowerPoint or Photoshop and take this car and move it over here. Yeah. Here's Sunday morning. Again, a guy named Tomas Martinez and his wife and a couple of kids who lived in Lemon Grove. I've intentionally fuzzed this a little bit, by the way. We're going to go for a picnic. And they did. And they went to what used to be Old Mission Gorge Road. Today, Mission Gorge Road there's a new one that cuts up in the hills, but the old one is now the Nebrosera Trail, I think it's called, right? And it's within Mission Trails Regional Park. Okay. So he parks the car, he tells his wife to get the wicker basket out, get the coffee, get the stuff that we need for the picnic, and we'll do that. And she says, okay, and he goes looking for a spot, and this is what he finds. He finds Louise Tauber hanging, nude. Nude, except she has her shoes on and her silk stockings. Her clothing is out of this picture, it's like I cropped it. Her clothing was neatly piled right there with her diary and her purse. And she's been let down a little bit. When he found her and when the sheriff came, she was more upright with her feet barely dragging. So this is the press the next morning. So I want you to, this kind of relates to the Coronado girl, Rebecca Zwell. No, virtually no woman in American history has ever taken all her clothes off and hanged herself. That's not how women do it, right? If they do commit suicide. In San Diego, they jump off the Coronado Bridge. I think they believe they just kind of go into the water and everything's good. It's like hitting concrete. You're going 87 miles an hour when you hit the water. I know this because I'm writing an article on suicides in Coronado Bridge. Anyway, so police come, they do cut her down. There's a whole series of these photographs that the San Diego Historical Center had, but only as negatives. They'd never developed them. So as I was doing my research, because they were newspaper photographs, they were very nice to me there because I work with them a lot. And they said, "You want to see negatives of Louise Tauber?" I go, "Yeah." So we had a big white box and we looked at it. I said, "I want that one and that one and that one and that one." Two of them that I sent to the publisher, they said, "No, these are gross. We're not going to use these. We're not going to use these." This one is, I think, in the book. So, newspaper article, here's the rope, here's her diary, and here's her clothing. The sheriffs still have this. So they're going to run DNA off of the rope. They're going to run some DNA off of the rope. So again, they started arresting all these people and talking and beating people and trying to get a confession. And they don't end up with that, with anything substantial. So here's what I decided. I did a whole bunch of research clearly. And when this book came out, I said, I think Herman Newby, retired Navy guy, did it. When they went through his house with a warrant, he had nude photographs of her when she was 16, taken at a cabin up in Julian, a place called Whispering Pines. I actually found the cabin. I went up and tormented those people. So Herman Newby had taken photographs of her and other young women, and then he made paintings out of them. And he said he was an artist, this artiste, right? So they arrested him on a morals charge and asked his wife, where were you that night, the night that she was murdered? Herman said they were up at a cabin in Julian. She said they were up at a cabin in Julian. I don't believe that alibi necessarily. Wives, husbands lie sometimes. I also think he coerced her. He was a very violent man. I'll tell you about that in a second. So when this book came out, he was my #1 absolute suspect. Since then, I've changed it slightly. It's a tie. It's one of the two, and the Sheriff's Department agrees with me. There's Herman. He was about 6'1". He always wore a big navy ring, like guys used to. And in the autopsy report, it said that poor Louise had been punched by a right-handed person wearing a very large ring, and it actually left an impression in her skull. So it's all circumstantial, nude photographs. He knew her, punched that way. He knew ropes really well. He'd been in the Navy, and on and on and on and on. And today, if my wife alibied me out for something, they would go to somebody else at the same time. They would go up to the cabin. They would ask other people, did you see these people that night? They just took her word for it and then put him in jail. She divorced him. Within 2 weeks of him being put in jail, his wife Ceci divorced him and moved up to Julian. I tracked down his daughter. So he left San Diego as a 47-year-old man. When he got out after 6 months, he moved to Arkansas and married a 17-year-old girl, because it's Arkansas, right? And they had a kid, 2 of them actually, and one was named Diane. So I tracked Diane down. Diane was living in Texas. She's 93. I tracked her down, and I wrote her a really nice letter on San Diego State Stationery. Not kosher, but I did. I said, hey, I'm doing a history of a couple murders back in 1931 in your dad's neighborhood. Did he ever mention it as you were growing up? Her response to me was this: Professor Carrico, you didn't mention it, but if you think my father killed that girl, he probably did. And then she went in, why? He had sexually molested her from the time she was 9 till 17. Yeah. Huh? His daughter. Yes. Bad man. He's a bad man. Even if he didn't do the murder, he's a bad man. Beat his son and beat the mother. So we communicated over several months, and what I wanted to know, without asking directly, is do you think your mother ever alibied him out for something he did? And if so, why? So I wrote it in a very tangential way, and she got back to me and she said, actually, when I was about 8 or 9, my father came home about 2 in the morning from a roadhouse in Indiana. Ironically, they lived where I was born. Herman Newby and his new wife and his daughter lived in Anderson, Indiana. It's just too strange. They probably hung up my grandparents, who knows. But he came home with his knuckles all beat up and a big cut on his lip. And he grabbed his wife out of bed, according to Diane, threw her against the wall, and said, if the sheriff comes by, you need to say I was here all night, and I was jacking up my car and it fell on me. And proceeded to beat on her, according to Diane. This is all unsolicited. I'm just asking her about family relations. And sure enough, the sheriff came from another town where he was and asked, the current Mrs. Newby, was your husband here all night? Oh yeah. He had a terrible accident out in the back lot with his, actually it was a tractor, with his tractor. That's what I think he did to his first wife. I think he threatened to kill her. Okay. Then we have this guy. This is the next to last slide, I think, perhaps. We have this guy. This is out of a newspaper report. Sarah Smith was 19 in 1931. He dated Louise Tauber. They used to go to the Oak Grove where she was found on dates. He described her at the time as loose. She was a loose girl. And he was a terrible womanizer. We won't go into all that, but he was a terrible womanizer. He was a pilot. He actually hung out with Lindbergh, because Lindbergh had his airplane built here in San Diego, at Roar, right? Yeah, so they hung out with it together. And at the time, his alibi was his mother alibied him out. He was 19, living at home, it was the Depression, and his mom said, yeah, he was here all night. Well, what were you doing? She said playing cards, he said listening to the radio. I mean, you can do both at the same time. This is one of the reports that the sheriff, Lieutenant Lisa, who I can't tell you her last name, shared with me. They were pretty sure he was the guy at the time. They were pretty sure. So, we'll kind of freeze that in time. This is the Oak Grove nearby. This is out of the newspaper of the time. So I went out looking for the oak tree, convinced it must still be there, and traipsed all over places you're not really supposed to be hiking in Mission Trails Regional Park, and finally went in and talked to a volunteer, a guy named Fred, and I said, so where's your oldest oaks? He said, oh, they're back here. And I said, they're not out there? And he goes, well, if they were out there, they're under the road. They're under Mission Gorge Road today. When they put through Mission Gorge, they cut out all those old oak trees. And I go, so the distance from here, this road, the old Mission Gorge Road, and where I want to ask you about is 1.1 mile. He said, yeah, that would be under the road today. And I said, well, 1931, and I told him the story. He goes, oh man, that's a great story. I got to tell that on my next tour. So we'll freeze that in time. The Reader article came out. I'll sum up here. The Reader article came out, and this gentleman called me, and he was 90-something, Tom, his name's Tom Jordan. He was 90-something. He calls me up and he says, oh, Mr. Carrico, I read your Reader article. That was fascinating. And I go, oh, thanks, yeah. And this is right before my book was about to go to the publisher. And he said, I need to tell you something. I knew somebody in your story. I'm going, 1931, how? And he goes, well, in 1950, Sarah Smith was my flight instructor. He was my flight instructor. And I go, oh, wow. Did he ever talk about the murder? And he goes, oh, let me tell you. I went, okay, tell me. He says, we were going back to Santee one day on the old Mission Trails Road, and he said he pulls off on this dirt road, and he drives along a bunch of oaks, and he stops at about a mile off the road, and I'm going, I'm liking this. And I had my tape recorder on. And He says, and Cyril gets out and he walks me to a big oak tree and he says, in 1931, a girl I was dating was hanged from that tree right there. Right there. And then they talked about, yeah, she was nude. She was found hanged nude. You know, I dated her and, you know, she would, so here's the sensitive part, I suppose. She would give me oral copulation sometimes. And she was quite the girl. And then they found her dead. So Tom asked him at the time, well, because he didn't know the story, how did she die? And Cyril told him she didn't die from hanging, she died from asphyxiation. She died from asphyxiation. She was dead before she was hanged. So he's putting some details out there, right? And Tom asked him, well, like choked? No, not choked to death. Oral copulation. From oral copulation. So Tom's going, you know, this 90-year-old man is beside himself telling me all this stuff. So I took that information and I called up the sheriff's department and talked to Lieutenant Lisa, and she goes, yeah, actually, she did die from oral copulation, we think. How do you know that? Because it's not in the newspapers. And I said, because a guy she was dating told a guy about it back in the 1950s. And I said, can you send me a little bit of the details about the autopsy? And she said, well, I'll just tell you what it says. You're going to love this. So I'm an anthropologist, right? There's a little bone right in here called the hyoid. And when you choke somebody, strangle them to death, it breaks. It breaks. But if it's oral copulation, it doesn't break, right? So it's not even that she was choked, plus they said there were no marks on her. So I called the medical examiner's assistant to the assistant, who's an ex-professor of mine, and I asked her, I say, Madeline, how many cases, this was last March, how many cases of strangulation or asphyxiation by oral copulation have you seen this year? She goes, 5. I go, what? And she goes, first of all, why are you asking me that, Richard? You ask me the weirdest questions. Last time it was about rigor mortis. The time before that it was how long does it take popcorn to digest, right, because of the stabbing. How long does it take popcorn to digest? The answer was, she did not die, by the way, the previous girl, she did not die close to midnight. She died at 3 in the morning. The popcorn was completely digested. And she says, and the one before that was about an egg sandwich. Why are you at? I hope this is for your book. I go, it is for my book. So she explained it. You can imagine, I'm not going to give you graphic details, but the person having oral copulation performed upon him simply refuses to release the person, and she chokes to death. And she chokes to death. So now it's a tie between Herman Newby and Mr. Smith. I contacted Mr. Smith's son, who used to run the observatory up in Julian. If you took the back way into Cuyamaca, there was a little dome there, and he moved out. He's convinced his father did it. So, Mr. Smith, Cyril Smith, not Herman Newby. This gentleman. So I contacted his son, who's about my age, and he just moved to Arizona. He actually changed his name. By the way, when he was 65 or 70, he was arrested for oral copulation with 2 15-year-old girls in Santee. It's all circumstantial. Just because you do that doesn't mean you kill somebody. Yeah. So I'm hoping they run the DNA on the rope because his son has given me his DNA. Which I told the sheriff I will not share with you, by the way. And she goes, well, you've told me this now, I can subpoena it. And I go, if I still have it when you subpoena me. So we have this interesting relationship. So right now it's a tie.
Why would you want to give her the DNA or the rope?
Well, because they're going to do DNA on the rope,
Yeah.
and they're going to find maybe his,
Yeah.
or maybe his, because I have his daughter's DNA, so I have stuff they don't have, right? And it would be very direct if it's either of these two men, whereas they're going to do it by DNA genealogical and end up with some cousin living in who knows where, right? And speculate that it could be this person. This is about as close as you can get a child, right? Yeah.
So he's holding on to it so they give him the information.
I want leverage. I want leverage.
So they want your information.
Yes. And she said, I will subpoena it, Mr. Carrico. I will get this from you, and I go, if I still have it.
When did this happen?
The DNA stuff,
Yeah.
6 months ago.
Oh.
Yeah, and they had just sent off the rope and her diary and her clothing for DNA. So
I can't believe anything left. I mean, must be shreds. But
yeah, the dress probably is, but the rope, surprisingly, in an evidence room, doesn't deteriorate. And supposedly, if it had DNA on it from his hands, from his sweat or his skin cells,
right.
it would still be there. So here's my thanks. So I've done not just the tip of the iceberg of these 3 cases, I've done the frost on the tip of the icebergs, if you can imagine 7 years of research. So I'm not going to go through these, but this is the San Diego History Center people. This is my daughter, who I call Nancy Drew, who tracked down some good stuff. This is the daughter of Mr. Newby, one of the potential killers. Jennifer Redmond, who is my editor. This is the medical examiner's assistant. Fred Kramer is a volunteer. David Lewis is a historian up in Julian. And then Tom Jordan was the friend of Sorrell, who gave me all this really great information. So they all did, in fact, make me wiser. That's me being wise.